Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The youngest one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided the property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, come home, you killed the fatted calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.
Doing that, we needed somebody that could read, and it wasn't me. So we wanted you to do that. Also, I want to, last week, I think it was last week, we recognized the fact that we had a new member of our church family that was born, the fifth child, is that right? And first son of Justin and Beth Cole, is that right? And he's here today. So we're thankful. So if you see them, now don't run over there, but at least wait time for the sermon to run over there. But we're thankful that everybody's doing good and thankful that he's here. So if you have your Bible, Luke 15, and for the last couple weeks, we've started the message by playing a game of some sort. So a couple weeks ago, we played a word association game, and then last week we played a quick game of Would You Rather, which the responses to that were very eye-opening. We're still trying to analyze some of the information that came in there. And today we're going to play one more game, and this will be one that some of you have played before. Some of you may be unfamiliar, but if you've got kids of a certain age, you'll know this one. It's titled, One of These Things is Not Like the Other. It started in 1968 on the popular show Sesame Street. Since then, it's evolved into several different layers, been applied to lots of different fields. But for our purposes this morning, we're going to keep it very simple. So I'm going to give you an example, and this will show you kind of what we're doing. So put the first picture up there. So as you can see, you got 4 things on the screen. 3 of them are like one another. 1 of them is not. So in this one, it's obvious. You've got an apple, an orange, and some bananas, and a bicycle. So all of those are good for you, but 3 of those will be classified as fruits, and the other is something that you ride on. So everybody would get that one right. Now we're going to make it a little bit harder. I want you to go to the next one. So you have Superman, Batman, Captain America, and Austin. From the sounds of it, I don't need to explain which of those does not fit with the other three, so we'll go to the next one. This is a good one. We have we've got 4 pictures of elite athletes. Serena Williams, Michelle Wie, Simone Biles, is that right? And then Jamie Reagan. So now we know all 4 are elite athletes, but 3 of the 4 are female, which leaves Jamie literally as the odd man out. Now, before I go to the next one, I can sense David is getting nervous. I can feel the tension, but I'm not going to mess with him. I never mess with Anita, so here we go. Here's the next one. 4 different types of gatherings, as you can see. So you got what looks like a kid's birthday party, maybe a Super Bowl party. Then there is a block party in the lower right-hand corner. And then over in the left-hand bottom corner, you have what looks like a normal sort of routine church service. Some of you have been to lots of services that look just like that. As you think back over your life, you've been to thousands of services where that picture could have been taken. Others of you are thinking about all the different types of parties that you've been to. So birthday parties, block parties, Super Bowl parties, family parties, the kind of parties you don't want to talk about at church. But here's what I suspect. Here's what I suspect is true. No matter how many church services you've attended, or how many parties you've been to, or what types of parties they were, you've probably never gotten those 2 things confused. Because one of those is not like the other. You've never walked in a church service and thought, oh, I didn't realize this was a party. And you've probably never walked in any type of party and thought, oh, I didn't realize we were going to a church service. In our minds, those are 2 different things that belong in 2 different categories. And so whenever you hear the word party, you probably don't think of church. And whenever you hear the word church, you probably don't think of a party. But it wasn't always like that. If you go back to the very beginning, it's interesting that whenever Jesus painted a picture of what he wanted the church to look like, he always painted it as something that looks a lot more like a party than it does what most of us think about whenever we think about a normal or a routine church service. You see a great example of this in Luke 15, and today we're in the final week of this 4-part series, which we've been working through this one incredible story. If you missed any of those, you can go back. They're on the website. They're on the FCC app for your smartphone. And in week 1, we talked about the experience of the younger brother. Then in week 2, we talked about the inexpressible love of the father directed toward his 2 lost sons. And last weekend, we looked at the older brother and how instead of celebrating the return of his younger brother into the family fold, his response was one of criticism and condemnation toward everybody involved. You know the story by now. You've heard it at least 4 times if you've been here, probably many times before that. But to understand the full magnitude of the story, you have to go back and you have to make sure you understand what it was that prompted Jesus to tell the story in the first place. So if you go back to verse 1 of Luke 15, Luke tells us there's this large group of people that have gathered around to listen to Jesus teach. And within that larger group of people, almost everybody in that group falls into one of 2 broad categories. Here's the way Luke says it in verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So again, on one side you had the tax collectors and sinners, what I called the lost people. They're people that just like us, many of them had engaged in wild living. I mean, their life was just totally off the rails. On the other side, you had the Pharisees and the religious teachers. You might think of them as the church people. And as we've said all along, it would be almost impossible to find 2 groups of people that were more at opposite ends of the spectrum than these 2 groups of people. In fact, as you read through Luke's gospel, one of the things you can trace, if you're paying attention, is the increasing opposition directed at Jesus from the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, because he spent so much time hanging out with and engaging with the people that Luke calls tax collectors and sinners. It first rears its ugly head back in Luke chapter 5, and you don't need to turn there because you probably remember the story. Jesus goes to a tax collector named Levi. We know him better as Matthew, and he invites Matthew to leave his career, to leave his post as a tax collector, and to follow after him. So in response to Jesus' invitation, Matthew decides he's going to hold this dinner party at his house, which he does. The only problem is he's going to invite all of his friends, and all of his friends are tax collectors just like him, because nobody else would invite them to their table. So Matthew has this huge table set, and he invites all the other tax collectors, and that's a big problem. Now, I know in our culture, we like to joke about the IRS, especially, this time of year, but we don't normally, personally hate the people that work there. But, at least you shouldn't. But in this first century instance, if you were a tax collector in the Jewish world, that was considered like the lowest of lowlifes. That was as low as you could go. To secure a position as a tax collector, you first had to place a bid on the right to collect taxes in a geographic area that was known as a tax district. And if you had the winning bid, the Romans would set you up in that position. You have to keep in mind the Romans were the sworn enemies of the Jewish people. And the reason people wanted the job in the first place is that the way it worked, the Romans would set the tax rate. So they might say, hey, you go and you collect 10% from everybody, and as long as they got their 10%, they didn't care how much you added on. So if you were a tax collector, the Romans said they want 10%, we're going to go and we're going to collect 11% from everybody, and we're going to keep that extra 1% for ourselves. And the Romans didn't care as long as they got their share. So you had this whole group of people who were literally stealing from their own people in order to line their own pockets. And everybody knew it, but nobody could do anything about it except turn all their hatred and all their viciousness towards the people involved. So, when the Pharisees and the other religious leaders come and they see Jesus eating with Matthew and his buddies who they knew were part of this corrupt system, there's a question that immediately comes up, and the question was, why do you eat with tax collectors and sinners? It's like they're watching all of this, they're watching this scene unfold, and they have no category in which to place something like this. They can't believe what they're seeing because it goes against everything they think they know about God. And so Jesus, hearing their question, answers them by saying this. He said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Now, you would think that might end the discussion, but rather than satisfying their curiosity and giving them a fresh vision of God's love for lost people, this became a major fault line of division between Jesus and the religious leaders that just continued to widen over the 3 years of his public ministry. In contrast to the tax collectors and sinners, you had the Pharisees. Relatively small group, but highly influential special interest group who prided themselves on their narrow interpretation of the Jewish law, their intense religious purity practices, and their extreme political views. The word Pharisee itself is taken from the Hebrew word that means separated or detached. And that's a pretty good picture of how these guys attempted to live their lives. Through their increasingly complex religious practices, their self-righteous attitudes, and their constant behind-the-scenes political scheming, they did everything they possibly could to remain separated from and detached from the people, places, and things that did not fit into their distorted vision of who God was and what God was about. And so as we pick up the story at the beginning of Luke 15, it's now a few months, maybe up to a year after this dinner party that took place at Matthew's house, and to their horror, the Pharisees discover that despite their repeated warnings, Jesus is still hanging out with people who on the surface of it seem to be about as far from God as anybody could possibly get. So in verse 2, when they accuse Jesus of welcoming and eating with sinners, they use what's called the present progressive tense, which all that means is this was not an isolated event. This was something that Jesus did over and over and over again, and it became a constant source of conflict between he and the religious leaders. In fact, it was such a source of conflict that upon seeing this latest example, Luke tells us the Pharisees immediately step back and they begin to mutter. You ever known anybody that liked to mutter? Are you sitting next to them? But in this case, because the religious leaders refused to understand why Jesus was doing what he was doing, they begin to criticize and complain. So you put all of that together, and now you know the backstory to what became the most famous story that Jesus ever told. Because it's in response to their muttering and their complaining that Jesus tells 3 consecutive stories that all follow the same pattern and essentially make the same point. We call them the story of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. And we've spent almost all of our time looking at the story of the lost son, but each of them is addressing the same problem, and it's the problem of what matters most. To the Pharisees, the things that mattered most were history, tradition, separation, and conformity. To Jesus, what mattered most were prodigals, people, parties. That shines through especially at the end of the third story, the story of the lost son. I'm not going to retell the whole story since Miss Charlotte just read it for us, but I do want to draw your attention to verse 25 of Luke 15. By this point, the younger brothers come home, and the father, rather than pushing him away, rather than piling on like we sometimes do, immediately begins the process of transforming his son's situation, which is a clear sign to the members of the community that he's accepting his son back into the family. Then, rather than immediately putting him back to work, he orders his servants to kill the fattened calf so that he can host a dinner party to celebrate the return of his son. And I want you to look at what happens in verse 25 after the party begins. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing, the sounds of a party. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your brother has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. So we talked about this last week, and because this is a parable, everybody in the story represents somebody else. So the younger brother represents the tax collectors and sinners, because just like them and just like some of us, he'd engaged in more than his fair share of wild living. Then you have the father in the story who represents God the Father, and then of course the older brother represents the Pharisees and the teachers of law. So in one sense, he represents kind of the church people, and as you work your way through the story, it becomes painfully obvious that the last thing he ever expected to encounter was a party. So it's upon recognizing his son's hesitancy to join the party that the father goes out and he tries to explain exactly what's going on. You've heard it one time. We'll read it again, verse 28. The older brother became angry and refused to go in, so his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you, and you never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Now, admittedly, there's a lot of different directions and a lot of different lessons to be gleaned from this story. And we could go on for several more weeks exploring all the different implications. But here's one of the big things that I think Jesus is doing as he tells the story, and that's that he's painting us a picture of what the church is supposed to look like. In contrast to the Pharisees, who viewed worship primarily as a perpetuation of certain traditions and conformity to carefully prescribed forms, Jesus tells us that the church is supposed to be a place where people outside the circle are invited into the circle. It's to be a place where lost people are found, where broken families are restored, and where situations are transformed. He's also careful to say that every local church should function as a place where parties are normal. But a lot of the time, that's not true. So how do you reach a point where that's true? How do you get to a point where our little outpost in this kingdom of God that we call the church becomes a place where it feels more like a party than it does a funeral? As you look at the three stories that Jesus told in Luke 15, there are three things that can help us make this an ongoing reality. And first, it happens whenever a church values lost people. That's the first step. In each of these three stories, they all begin the same way, and that's with something of value that's missing. So in the first story, it's a sheep. In the first century, sheep were not used for meat. They were used for wool. So if you owned a sheep long enough, that could prove to be very valuable to you. So because of that, anytime a sheep separated itself from the flock, everybody in the community would stop what they were doing and they would join the search for that lost sheep. In the second story, it's a lost coin. And the best way to understand that, it was part of the woman's wedding dowry. So to put it in modern terms, this would be like if you lost the ring or the diamond out of your engagement ring. If that's ever happened to you, you know until you find it, everything else stops. You're turning the cushions over, you're shining the light under the bed, you're retracing your steps because nothing in that moment is as important to you as finding the diamond out of your ring because it's something of value that's been lost. And when you think about it, there are all kinds of different churches that value all kinds of different things. And sometimes even within a single church, you'll find competing values. Just like the Pharisees, there are some churches that value their man-made traditions and conformity to a certain image above everything else. Other churches value things like a certain style of music, a certain kind of preaching, a particular Bible translation, a denominational label, a certain type of dress, a certain kind of liturgy, or maybe there are individual programs that have long since lost their effectiveness, but because somebody in the church values them, they continue on. Every church is susceptible to that. But there are some that have taken it to an extreme, and they've chosen to prioritize something other than reaching lost people. I've got a picture I want to show you. This is a headline taken from the Atlantic. This was back in 2018. It says, America's epidemic of empty churches. And the article talks about how one of the hottest emerging real estate markets nationally is the increasing number of abandoned church buildings that are being transformed into apartments, upscale restaurants, office spaces, art galleries, antique shops, and even indoor skate parks. And if you think this is not happening, I looked it up last week. There are 27 churches for sale in one zip code in Louisville, Kentucky. And you don't have to drive to Louisville to find one. With overall church attendance and charitable giving on the decline, especially after the COVID pandemic, somewhere around 10 to 12,000 churches a year are closing their doors. And while some of that probably could not have been prevented because of demographics, if you were to do an autopsy of many of these now closed churches, there are two things you would most likely discover. The first thing is that at some point in their history, they stopped striving to reach the next generation. And somebody decided, hey, it's okay to just reach the current generation, and they forgot about the next generation. The other thing you would most likely find is that in most cases, at some point, there was a shift in thinking, and maybe it was articulated, maybe it was never verbalized, in which it became more important to the leaders of the church to cater to the likes and dislikes of the people that were already found than it was to reach and connect with people who were still lost. And the end result is always a slow and painful death. That leads to the second thing you see here in Luke 15, and that's that a church where this becomes normal, that functions as a place where parties are normal, always takes the initiative in connecting with lost people. One of the details that Jesus includes in all three of these stories, to some degree or another, is that in none of them do the people described sit back and wait for that thing of value to return to them. Instead, they seize the initiative in recovering that thing that had been lost. So, for example, in verse 4, Jesus said it like this: suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? Then you get down to verse 8. Suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? Now, I know before we get to the next one, I know what some of you are thinking, because you've been here the whole series and you think, that's true of the first two, but in the second story, the son goes off to the distant country and the father waits at home for him to return. And that would be partly true until you get to verse 20 when Jesus said, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. So how do you see something that's still a long way off? Well, you have to be looking for it. And that's what this father was doing. He was looking for an opportunity, and once he saw his opportunity, he ran to his son so that he wouldn't miss his opportunity. He saw an opportunity, and then he immediately seized that opportunity. And just as a side note, Luke 15 is the only place in the Scripture where God the Father is portrayed as being in a hurry. And you say, why is he in a hurry? He's in a hurry because he wants to connect with his lost son. He does the same thing with the older brother. In verse 28, when Jesus said, the older brother became angry and refused to go in, so his father went out and pleaded with him. He didn't sit back and wait for him to come in. Instead, he went out to him. Now, contrast that with the approach that many of us take when it comes to connecting with people who are far from here. Here's what most of us do. Because we live in a community where there seems to be a church on every corner and at least one preacher in every family, we assume that because there's so many churches and so many preachers, that if anybody were even remotely interested or had questions about their relationship with God, that they could walk into any one of those churches, they could initiate a conversation with anybody that goes to any one of those churches, and they could find answers to their questions. And so, since they already know we're here, we assume that if they're ever interested or if they have any questions, they'll just come to us. So there's no need for us to do anything out of the ordinary to connect with them. I mean, if they want to come, they'll come on their own. And once upon a time, in a land far, far away, that might have been effective. But not anymore. For most people with little to no church experience, which is most people in our community, the idea of just visiting a worship service creates a feeling in them that would be like the feeling you would experience if you were forced to visit a mosque, or if you traveled somewhere and went to a worship service in which everything was done in a foreign language. That would be a similar feeling to what most people in our community experience when they even think about going to church. They don't know where to park. They don't know which door to go in. They're not sure what to wear. They don't know when to stand and when to sit. They don't recognize the symbols. They're not sure what to do with their kids. They've never heard the songs. Most of them have never stood next to somebody else and sang outside of a concert. They don't know, they don't understand when somebody says, hey, open your Bible to this. They've never opened their Bible. They don't know where to find that. And they don't know even if they're allowed to come, much less if they're invited to come. That's why in the current climate, in which church attendance in our community is under 11%, that churches that are going to have a future are going to have to prove they're willing to do things that nobody else is willing to do to reach people that nobody else is going to reach. Now's not the time to sit back and wait for people to come to us. It's time for us to do what Jesus said to do at the end of Luke 14, verse 23, when he tells this story about this incredible banquet and everybody's invited, but nobody comes. And here's what Jesus says you're supposed to do. Then the master told his servant, go out to the back roads and country lanes and compel them to come in so that my house would be full. Let me ask you, when's the last time you felt compelled to talk to somebody who was far from God? When's the last time you couldn't sleep at night because you knew one of your coworkers was far from God? When's the last time you prayed for more than 30 seconds about somebody in your family that you know if they were to die today, you know where they'd go? Now, there's one more piece to this, and it's the one that's most often overlooked. And it's a church where parties become the norm, is a place that celebrates when lost people are found. And each of these stories that Jesus shared in Luke 15, once that thing of value that was lost is recovered, they always end with a celebration. So in the first story, the shepherd grabs all his shepherd buddies and he says, hey, let's celebrate this sheep. In the second story, it says the woman calls her friends and neighbors and they have this little get-together. But in the third story, it's a little more than just a small get-together. It's more of a block party than a birthday party. There's music and there's dancing, there's food, there's lots of people. And what I want you to catch is that Jesus sees all of that as a natural response to the return of the lost son. It's incredible when you think about it. Of all the images that Jesus could have used to describe what God's kingdom is supposed to look like, he chose to use the imagery of a party that's thrown in celebration of someone who was once far from God being brought back into the family. It's also interesting, to me at least, that whenever Jesus talked about what a church is supposed to be, rather than describing it in terms of worship styles and building architecture and dress codes and denominational labels and Bible translations and ministry programs or any of the hundreds of other things that we tend to obsess over in our culture, he instead described it, and he described it in terms of what it values. And while it's true that there are all kinds of churches that value all kinds of different things, when you read the New Testament, it's clear that the churches that are closest to Jesus' heart are the churches that value reaching lost people and celebrating whenever a lost person is found. And for the churches that fulfill the vision that Jesus painted, that's where it starts. And that's where it ends. Is to take people who are far from God, bring them into the family, and then help them become the people they were created to be. Earlier this week, I had lunch with a guy who new to our community, and almost as soon as we sat down across the table from him, he looked at me and he said, tell me about your church. What kind of church is it? Now, because I've been doing this for a long time, I knew what he meant by that, and you probably do too. He wanted to know the basic details of where we fit on a certain landscape and how we do things and all that. But his question got me thinking, exactly what kind of church is this? The way Jesus tells the story, while there might be hundreds of different types of churches, You boil it all down, just like he talked about in Luke 15 at the beginning. Big crowd of people, but most of them fall into one or two categories, and that's kind of the way it works in the church. So there are some churches, and maybe you've been to some, that look and function as if they're being led by one of the Pharisees that were constantly criticizing Jesus, and they're filled with people who could easily identify with the older brother. Others more closely resemble the experience of the younger brother. They're places where people who were once far from home are not only invited back home, but they're welcomed home and they're celebrated once they return. So there are some churches, and you know this, that are obsessed with things like perpetuating a tradition, conformity to a certain image, maintaining and expanding political power, and keeping their distance from anybody who is not exactly like them. While there are others that are focused on sharing the inexhaustible love of God with the people who need it most. And the question that we have to continually ask ourselves is, which of those two are we? Because the truth is, there are at least two different types of churches. And one of them is not at all like the other. I want you to stand with me. As we conclude our time looking at this incredible story, we're going to sing a song that I really love. It's titled The Table. If you pay attention to the lyrics, the song talks about how all of us are invited to the table. So God's throwing this party, and no matter how far you've drifted, no matter how long you've been gone, no matter how messed up you've been, He invites you to the table. You've got an invitation to His feast. But in order to get to that place, you first have to accept your invitation. So the song lyric says, "Come all you weary, come and find that His yoke is easy and His burden is light. He's able, He'll restore at the table of the Lord." You know the song. You've heard it before. And some of you have heard that your entire life. In fact, you've heard it so much that you could explain it to somebody. If somebody came to you and said, "Hey, how does any of this work?" You could explain it with very little time to pray. You've heard it so much that it's become sort of like the background noise of your life. You're not sure where you learned it, but you just sort of always known it. But here's the problem with that. It's possible to know that without ever experiencing that. You can explain it to somebody else. You can explain it to yourself, but you may have not ever experienced it. So before you let these moments pass, I want you to ask yourself, have I actually accepted His invitation to the party? If you have, then in the next few moments, I want you to ask the Lord to give you a renewed passion for helping other people experience what you've already experienced, because I'll be honest, our community needs it desperately. But if your answer to that question is no, and you've never experienced it for yourself, then I want to ask you to consider doing that today. If you're ready, if you have questions, if you want to pray with somebody, if you're not sure how any of this would work, maybe you're ready to move your membership, maybe you're ready to be baptized, whatever it is for you. We're going to sing this song, and if you need to talk to somebody, David will be here, and I'll be right here, and we'll be glad to help you.